Royal Guard tears open trunk again, finds Princess Charlotte's school uniform hidden inside. Most of the palace was still asleep, with only the faint hum of early activity from the kitchens and a few guards patrolling the hallways. The grand building had a rhythm of its own, a kind of serene heartbeat that only those who worked there daily could truly feel. But on this particular morning, the usual calm was interrupted by something unusual, something small but enough to catch the trained eyes of the royal guards. Among the many corridors of the palace, there was one that was rarely used. It led to a section of the building that had long been considered less important for daily activities, often only visited during cleaning schedules or occasional storage runs. In this quiet corridor stood a trunk that seemed out of place. It wasn't large, but its presence was noticeable. It had been there before, yes, and it had been inspected, but today something about it seemed different. Perhaps it was the way the morning sun hit its polished surface, or maybe it was the faint sound that came from the direction of the trunk, a slight creak, almost as if it had been moved slightly since the last time anyone had looked. Whatever it was, it caused a ripple of attention among the guards stationed nearby. Lieutenant Henry Davies, a man in his mid-40s with years of experience in palace security, was the first to notice the subtle signs that something might be amiss. He was tall, with a commanding presence that made everyone listen when he spoke. Davies had been trained to pay attention to details that others might overlook: the tilt of a picture frame, the slight shift of a rug, even the placement of ordinary objects like this trunk. For him, the palace was not just a building. It was a living environment, and every item within it had its purpose. Anything out of place could mean a story, a secret, or even a potential problem waiting to unfold. "Have you noticed that trunk again?" Davies asked quietly to one of the junior guards, a young man named Oliver, who was still learning the ways of palace security. Oliver was diligent but inexperienced, and he looked at the trunk with a mixture of curiosity and mild concern. "It's been here before, right?" he replied, shifting slightly on his feet. "Yes," Davies said, nodding, "but today it feels different. We should take a closer look." His tone was calm yet firm, a voice that carried both authority and reassurance. Even the smallest of staff knew that when Davies suggested investigating something, it wasn't to create trouble. It was to maintain the palace's safety and order. The guards gathered closer, their footsteps echoing softly against the marble floors. Each one of them had been through countless drills and security checks, but there was an unspoken understanding that every inspection could be important, no matter how trivial it seemed at first glance. As they approached the trunk, Davies carefully observed every detail. The lock, the seams, even the small scratches on its surface, all of these clues told a story. Though it was a simple piece of furniture, in the context of the palace, it could hold items of significance. And in a place where every item had its place and purpose, the misplacement of even a single object could be noteworthy. The trunk itself was made of polished wood, reinforced with brass corners and an old-fashioned lock. It had a history, Davies knew, likely having been part of the palace's collection for many years. Such trunks were used to store everything from ceremonial clothing to important documents. Yet, what made this one unusual was not its construction but its location. It was tucked into a corner where very few people passed, almost as if it was trying to remain hidden. And for a palace as busy as Kensington, anything that seemed to hide was worth noticing. The young guard, Oliver, leaned slightly closer, his eyes scanning the lock. "Do you think it's dangerous?" he whispered, half joking but also genuinely curious. Davies smiled faintly. "Not dangerous," he replied, "but unusual, and in my experience, unusual can mean important." The air in the corridor was quiet, almost reverent, as the guards continued to examine the trunk. The polished floors reflected their uniforms, creating an illusion of more guards than there actually were. Dust floated lightly in the air, visible only when caught by the shafts of sunlight streaming through the nearby window. It was a calm scene, yet the tension among the guards was palpable. They knew that palace life, while often routine, could surprise anyone at any moment. A misplaced object could lead to confusion, a security breach, or even a story that might reach the media. It was their duty to ensure that nothing escaped attention. As Davies crouched slightly to inspect the trunk more closely, he noticed a small detail that seemed to confirm his instincts. There was a faint scratch near the lock, as if someone had tried to open it recently but failed or stopped midway. That small mark told him that this trunk had been interacted with in the past hours, possibly by someone who wanted to keep it unnoticed. In his years of service, he had learned that even the tiniest clue could lead to understanding bigger events. This wasn't just a trunk, it was a puzzle waiting to be solved, and he was determined to uncover its secrets. Oliver, standing beside him, listened attentively as Davies spoke softly about what they were seeing. It was a learning moment for the young guard, an example of how attention to small details could prevent larger problems. "Every item has a reason to be where it is," Davies explained. "And if something isn't where it should be, there's a reason for that too." He gestured toward the trunk. "This isn't just a piece of furniture, it's a clue." Oliver nodded, understanding the gravity of what they were dealing with. To someone outside the palace, it might seem like a simple box, but for the guards, it was an object that demanded careful attention. The decision to investigate further wasn't made lightly. Protocol required that any potentially important item be documented, and that any unusual findings be reported to the higher authorities. Davies called over a few more guards to ensure that the inspection would be thorough. Each guard had a role. Some would observe, some would record, and others would ensure the corridor remained secure. Even though the situation seemed small, they all understood that palace procedures were designed to handle both minor and major incidents with equal care. As the guards prepared to open the trunk, the atmosphere shifted slightly. There was a quiet sense of anticipation, a mix of curiosity and professional focus. The palace was full of history, secrets, and stories, and every corner had witnessed moments that were never spoken aloud. This trunk, seemingly ordinary, might hold something that could add to that history, even if just a small, personal detail of daily life within the royal household. With careful hands, Davies reached for the lock, noting its old craftsmanship and sturdy build. He had seen countless locks over the years, but this one required a steady touch. The others watched closely, ready to assist if needed, but knowing that Davies' experience made him the right person to handle this delicate moment. The palace was a place of tradition, and every act, even opening a trunk, was done with respect for its rules and customs. As the lock clicked open, the anticipation among the guards grew. They had no idea what they would find, but they knew that whatever was inside could reveal something unexpected. The palace was full of stories, some grand, some personal, and this moment held the possibility of uncovering one of the smaller, intimate tales that rarely made it into public knowledge. For now, the corridor remained silent, the soft morning light illuminating the polished floor and the curious faces of the guards, all waiting to see what lay hidden within the unassuming wooden trunk. Lieutenant Henry Davies took a deep breath as he lifted the lid of the trunk. The polished wood felt smooth under his fingers, but the lock had left faint scratches on the surrounding metal, hints of a previous attempt to open it. The guards stood quietly around him, their eyes fixed on the trunk, waiting for any sign of what might be inside. The morning light from the tall palace windows reflected off the polished brass corners of the trunk, casting small golden streaks on the floor. Even in this calm corridor, a feeling of anticipation hung in the air. Inside the trunk, everything seemed neatly arranged. There was no mess, no random clutter, just carefully folded items. On top, Davies noticed a stack of small clothes. He picked up the topmost piece and examined it closely. It was delicate, clearly designed for someone much younger, with neat stitching and clean folds. His trained eyes immediately recognized the precision of palace tailoring. Everything about it suggested care, thought, and importance. The young guard Oliver leaned closer, curiosity sparkling in his eyes. "What is it, sir?" he whispered, barely able to contain his excitement. Davies didn't answer immediately. He studied the item carefully before responding. "It's a uniform," he said slowly, "but not just any uniform." The realization hit the other guards as well. They knew the palace held many garments for ceremonial purposes, for staff, and for members of the royal family, but this small uniform seemed personal. It wasn't part of any official display or event. Davies gently lifted more of the items in the trunk, revealing a neatly folded blouse, a pleated skirt, and a small pair of shoes. Each piece was meticulously kept, as though it had been placed there to be preserved. The guards exchanged glances, all understanding the significance of what they were seeing. It was a glimpse into the personal life of someone very important within the palace walls. Davies carefully placed the uniform on a nearby table for better inspection. His hands were steady, but his mind raced with questions. How had these items ended up in a trunk in a corridor rarely used? They were clearly valuable, not just in material, but in personal significance. For a palace so familiar with order and routine, this small anomaly suggested a story waiting to be uncovered. Every guard present sensed the weight of the moment. This was no longer a routine check. This was a discovery that demanded careful thought and consideration. Oliver, who had been observing quietly, couldn't help but ask the question that was on everyone's mind. "Do you think someone put it here by mistake?" he asked. Davies shook his head slowly. "Mistake," he replied. "In this palace, every item has a place. Accidents happen, yes, but this seems deliberate. Someone wanted these items to remain hidden, at least for a time." His words made the younger guards more alert. In the palace, nothing was random and nothing escaped notice for long. Even the smallest act of misplacement could lead to confusion, concern, or curiosity among the staff. The lieutenant decided to document everything carefully. He called for a notebook and began to write down details: the type of trunk, the lock, the items inside, and their condition. Every fold, every stitch, every mark mattered. Palace protocol required careful recording of unusual findings, and Davies was meticulous about following it. As he wrote, he noticed the uniform's small details: the fabric, the buttons, the crispness of the pleats. Each feature indicated that this uniform belonged to a young member of the royal family, and likely someone very specific. The realization settled in. This wasn't just a set of clothes. This was Princess Charlotte's school uniform. The guards around him whispered quietly among themselves, careful not to speak too loudly in the quiet corridor. The palace had strict rules about discussing royal matters, and everyone present understood the importance of discretion. But curiosity was natural, and it was difficult to ignore the significance of the discovery. A school uniform might seem ordinary to an outsider, but for the royal household, it represented routine, privacy, and the carefully managed life of a young princess. Every item of clothing in the palace carried a story, and now the guards had stumbled upon one of the more personal tales hidden behind the palace doors. Davies gently lifted the skirt and examined its details. The stitching was precise, and the fabric was high quality, as expected. He noticed the small initials stitched inside, a sign of the meticulous care that went into preparing each item for the princess. It was clear that whoever had placed the uniform in the trunk had handled it with respect. There was no sign of damage or neglect. It had been folded carefully, almost reverently, as though someone wanted to ensure it remained in perfect condition. This careful handling added another layer of intrigue to the story. Why would someone hide a uniform so carefully in a corridor? The lieutenant motioned for the guards to remain patient while he continued his inspection. He lifted the shoes from the bottom of the trunk. They were small, polished, and perfectly matched the uniform. Every item suggested attention to detail, and every detail suggested intention. Davies realized that this was not a simple case of misplacement. Someone had deliberately hidden these items, and their careful preservation indicated a motive beyond simple forgetfulness. Perhaps it was a precaution, perhaps it was oversight, or perhaps it was something more personal, an act of care by a member of the palace staff who wanted to ensure the princess's belongings remained untouched. As the guards continued to examine the contents, Davies' mind wandered to the logistics of palace life. Kensington was a place of schedules, routines, and constant attention to detail. Every item, every uniform, every accessory had a designated place. Misplacing something, particularly an item belonging to a member of the royal family, was not taken lightly. The fact that the uniform had ended up in a seldom-used corridor suggested that it had been moved deliberately, either for safekeeping or perhaps as part of some internal reorganization. Whatever the reason, the lieutenant knew it was important to get to the bottom of it without creating unnecessary alarm. Oliver, still observing quietly, asked another question. "Sir, do we tell the higher officials right away?" Davies thought carefully before responding. "Not yet," he said. "First, we need to understand the situation fully. If we react too quickly without information, we might cause unnecessary concern. Let's figure out how it ended up here first." His calm approach reassured the younger guards, who had been nervously shifting from foot to foot. It was clear that while this was a personal discovery, it also had the potential to become a delicate situation. Handling it with patience and care was essential. The lieutenant continued to sort through the trunk, making careful notes about each item. He checked for labels, marks, or anything that could provide information about the origin of the storage. Everything seemed consistent with a well-kept school uniform, complete with markings that only palace staff would recognize. It was a glimpse into a side of royal life that the public rarely saw, the quiet, private moments of everyday life within the palace walls. Here, a young princess had her routine, her clothing prepared with care, and yet this private aspect of life had momentarily slipped into mystery. After a few moments, Davies stood and looked at the guards around him. "We need to secure this," he said. "No one touches anything until we know exactly why it's here. Every item must remain as we found it." His voice carried authority, and the guards nodded in understanding. They knew that in the palace, protocol and discretion were paramount. Handling royal items required respect, patience, and the knowledge that even the smallest misstep could have consequences. Today, the discovery of this small uniform had turned a routine morning into a moment of significance. The corridor remained quiet as the guards began to carefully move the trunk to a safer location for further inspection. Davies ensured that everything was documented and that the younger guards learned from the process. This was more than a discovery. It was a lesson in observation, patience, and respect for the traditions of the palace. For Oliver, it was an experience he would never forget, a moment where ordinary objects revealed extraordinary stories. For Davies, it was another reminder that in a place like Kensington, even the smallest details could carry weight, meaning, and history. By the time the trunk was secured, the atmosphere had shifted from curiosity to quiet reflection. The morning light continued to fill the corridor, highlighting the intricate details of the palace walls, the polished floors, and the uniforms of the guards. Yet even as the world outside carried on with its routines, inside, a small story had unfolded, a story of care, mystery, and the meticulous life of a young princess. The trunk, ordinary to the untrained eye, had become a symbol of the unseen, quiet diligence that kept the palace running smoothly and preserved the personal lives of those within its walls. Lieutenant Henry Davies took a steadying breath and leaned closer to the trunk. The sunlight streaming through the palace windows caught on the polished brass corners, giving them a faint, golden glow. Around him, the young guards watched with a mixture of curiosity and anticipation, sensing that the moment had shifted from a routine inspection to something far more intriguing. Every guard knew the palace was full of surprises, but few expected that a quiet morning could turn into a moment of discovery with such personal significance. The air felt heavier, almost charged with a quiet tension, as if the trunk itself held a secret that was waiting to be revealed. Davies carefully lifted the topmost layers of clothing, one by one, his hands steady but precise. The items were neatly folded, each carefully placed as though someone had taken great care to preserve them. His trained eyes recognized the subtle signs. The fabric was fine, tailored with care, and perfectly maintained. There were small details that told a story of thoughtfulness, buttons sewn with precision, pleats perfectly aligned, and labels that only palace staff would recognize. He realized that whoever had stored these items had intended them to remain untouched, yet somehow they had ended up in this corridor. It was clear that this was no ordinary collection of clothes. It had a purpose, and that purpose was deeply personal. As Davies lifted the folded blouse from the trunk, he caught a small, familiar detail. The buttons bore the tiny initials CC stitched delicately into the fabric. He froze for a brief moment, the realization hitting him with quiet force. His eyes swept over the rest of the items, the pleated skirt, the small pair of shoes, the carefully folded socks, and all of it pointed unmistakably to a single person, Princess Charlotte. The uniform was hers. The guards around him exchanged subtle glances, understanding the significance without needing to speak aloud. This was not just a set of clothing. It was a glimpse into the daily life of a young princess, a private part of her world that few would ever see. Oliver, the youngest guard, could barely contain his excitement. "Sir, it's really hers," he whispered, his voice barely audible. Davies nodded slowly, keeping his tone calm but firm. "Yes," he said, "this is Princess Charlotte's school uniform." And judging by its condition, it hasn't been worn recently, which means someone has been storing it carefully. But why here in this corridor? That's the question we need to answer. His words created a new layer of curiosity among the guards. They had expected routine inspections, not a direct connection to the royal family, and the significance of the discovery added weight to their responsibility. The lieutenant placed the uniform gently on a nearby table, spreading it out so every detail could be examined. The skirt was neatly pleated, the blouse crisp and clean, and the shoes polished to a shine. The care with which the items had been kept was remarkable. It was obvious that whoever had stored them had not wanted them to be damaged, lost, or forgotten. This was not just a precaution, it was an act of deliberate preservation. Every stitch and fold told a story of attention, and for the guards this was both fascinating and puzzling. Who would go to such lengths to hide and protect a uniform, and why? Davy's mind began to work through the possibilities. Kensington Palace was a place of strict routines and careful organization. Every item had a designated space, every garment a specific wardrobe. For a school uniform to end up in a rarely used corridor suggested a deliberate action rather than an accident. Perhaps a staff member had temporarily moved it for safekeeping, or maybe it had been placed there during a reorganization of the princess's belongings. The lieutenant knew that in a place as meticulously managed as the palace, even small deviations could have significance. This wasn't a careless mistake. It was a story waiting to be understood. The guards circled the table quietly, careful not to touch anything, their curiosity mounting with each passing second. They examined the small details, the fabric, the buttons, the pleats, and even the faint scent of freshly laundered clothes. These were not ordinary items. They were part of the daily life of a young royal. The realization that they were holding something so personal brought a quiet respect among the guards. It was a reminder that their job was not only to protect the palace, but also to preserve the dignity and privacy of its inhabitants. This was a responsibility they took seriously. As Davies continued his inspection, he noticed something else. Small marks on the inside lining of the blouse, barely visible but telling. They were slight creases, as if the uniform had been folded for storage rather than worn frequently. This detail suggested that the uniform had been hidden for some time, deliberately kept out of reach. It was a puzzle, and every detail mattered. The lieutenant knew that piecing together this story required careful observation and patience. One wrong assumption could lead to misunderstanding, and in the palace, discretion was always paramount. Oliver, still observing closely, asked another question. "Sir, do you think someone hid it on purpose?" Davies considered the question carefully. "Yes," he said finally. "Everything about this trunk and its contents points to intentional storage. The uniform has been preserved carefully, yet it is not where it belongs. Someone wanted to keep it hidden, at least temporarily. We just need to find out who and why." His calm, thoughtful approach reassured the younger guards, who were eager for answers but understood the importance of handling the situation with care. In moments like this, patience and attention to detail were more valuable than haste. The lieutenant took a moment to reflect on the broader context. Kensington Palace was more than a residence. It was a hub of activity, tradition, and careful management. Every member of the royal household, from the staff to the young royals themselves, had routines that were followed meticulously. Misplacing something as personal as a school uniform was not common, and yet here it was, hidden in a corridor where few people passed. This small mystery hinted at the behind-the-scenes world of palace life, a world that balanced tradition, privacy, and security with the daily needs of those who lived there. As he carefully documented each item, Davies thought about the young princess herself. Princess Charlotte was known for her bright, curious nature, and for a child her age, school life was a central part of her routine. Her uniform was more than clothing. It represented her daily life, her school experiences, and the careful attention her staff gave to ensure her comfort and readiness. Discovering it hidden away like this was a reminder of how the palace staff worked tirelessly behind the scenes to manage every detail of royal life, often without recognition or notice. The guards continued their silent observation as Davies examined the shoes. They were small, polished, and perfectly matched to the uniform. The care with which they had been stored suggested that whoever placed them here had a clear understanding of the princess's needs. It was a small but significant detail that added to the mystery. Why move the uniform away from its proper storage? Why hide it carefully instead of leaving it where it belonged? Every detail seemed deliberate, and every observation raised new questions for the lieutenant and his team. After a few minutes, Davies motioned for the young guards to step back slightly. "We need to secure this trunk," he said firmly. "No one touches anything until we know the full story." "Everything remains as we found it." The guards nodded in understanding, their respect for both the protocol and the discovery evident. They knew that in the palace, discretion was paramount, and handling items belonging to the royal family required care and attention. Even a seemingly simple uniform could carry significance far beyond its appearance. As the trunk was carefully moved to a more secure location for further inspection, Davies reflected on the day's events. A routine morning had transformed into a moment of discovery, revealing a small but meaningful glimpse into the personal life of Princess Charlotte. The uniform, ordinary to an outsider, had become a symbol of the hidden details that made palace life both fascinating and complex. The careful preservation, the hidden location, and the attention to detail all told a story of care, responsibility, and the quiet diligence of the staff who worked tirelessly to support the royal family. By the time the trunk was secured and the uniform carefully placed on a table for continued observation, the atmosphere had shifted from curiosity to quiet reflection. The morning light continued to filter through the tall windows, illuminating the corridor and the faces of the guards who had witnessed this unusual discovery. For a moment, the palace seemed to pause, holding its breath as if acknowledging the significance of the moment. A small piece of the private life of Princess Charlotte had been uncovered, and with it came a renewed sense of duty among the guards to protect, preserve, and respect the hidden stories of royal life. After securing the trunk and carefully placing Princess Charlotte's uniform on a nearby table, Lieutenant Henry Davies knew that the discovery was only the beginning. The real challenge now was understanding how and why the uniform had ended up in a corridor rarely used by anyone. The palace was a place of order and routine, where every item had a specific place, and deviations from that order were unusual and noteworthy. To unravel the mystery, Davies needed patience, observation, and the help of the palace staff, who had years of experience managing the daily life of the royal household. He motioned for the other guards to stay close but maintain a respectful distance. "We need to approach this carefully," he said. "No one touches anything else until we have more information. Every detail matters, even the smallest." The younger guards nodded in understanding. They had learned from Davies in the past that patience and discretion were often more important than immediate action. This was not a simple case of misplaced clothing. It was a glimpse into the private life of a young princess, and it required thoughtful investigation. Davies began by reviewing the trunk itself. Its construction was solid, designed to last for decades, and the lock was sturdy but not overly complex. There were no signs of forced entry or damage beyond the faint scratches near the lock, which suggested a previous attempt to open it or perhaps the movement of the trunk itself. This small clue hinted that someone may have interacted with the trunk recently, but not in a careless or destructive manner. Whoever had placed the uniform here had done so intentionally, with thought and care. The lieutenant made a note of every observation, knowing that a clear record would help later if further questions arose. Next, he turned his attention to the items inside. Each piece of clothing was neatly folded and showed no signs of wear beyond what would be expected for a school uniform. The blouse was crisp, the pleats in the skirt perfectly aligned, and the shoes polished to a shine. There were faint marks on the inside lining of the garments, likely from careful folding and storage. Nothing suggested negligence or damage. Everything indicated respect and consideration. For Davies, these details were important because they helped narrow down the possibilities. This was not a case of a uniform simply being misplaced. It had been deliberately preserved. Davies then decided to speak with the palace staff, who were most familiar with Princess Charlotte's daily routine. He called for the senior housekeeper, Mrs. Linton, a kind but firm woman who had been with the royal household for over 20 years. She arrived promptly, her eyes widening slightly as she saw the uniform laid out on the table. "Lieutenant Davies," she said softly, "I see you've found something important." Her tone was respectful, tinged with curiosity, but also careful, as she was well aware of the need for discretion in all matters relating to the royal family. "Yes, Mrs. Linton," Davies replied. "This uniform has been stored in a corridor rarely used. Can you help us understand why it might have been placed there?" She walked over, her eyes scanning the uniform with practiced attention. After a moment, she nodded thoughtfully. "It is indeed Princess Charlotte's uniform," she said. "As for why it was moved, there could be several reasons. Sometimes, staff members temporarily relocate items for cleaning, reorganization, or preservation. Occasionally, someone might move a uniform to keep it safe if they are concerned it could be damaged during daily activity. But I would need to check the records to be certain." This explanation made sense to Davies, but he knew it was only part of the story. In a household as meticulously organized as Kensington Palace, even temporary relocations were usually noted. The fact that this uniform ended up hidden in a seldom-used corridor suggested that either the records had been overlooked or that the person who moved it had acted independently, perhaps out of personal concern for the princess's belongings. To find the truth, Davies decided to speak with the junior staff members as well, those who were directly responsible for organizing clothing and maintaining the princess's wardrobe. Over the next few hours, Davies and the guards quietly interviewed several staff members. Each conversation provided pieces of the puzzle, though none offered a complete explanation. One staff member remembered seeing the uniform in the corridor a few days prior, while another recalled temporarily moving items from one storage area to another during cleaning. Small details emerged. The trunk had been placed in the corridor intentionally, it had been handled carefully, and the items inside had been treated with respect. No one claimed to know exactly why the uniform had ended up there, but everyone agreed that it had been preserved with great care. As Davies pieced together the timeline, a clearer picture began to emerge. It seemed that during a routine reorganization of Princess Charlotte's wardrobe, a junior staff member had temporarily placed the uniform in the trunk to protect it from being accidentally damaged. The corridor, though rarely used, had seemed like a safe spot at the time. However, due to a lapse in communication, the relocation had not been recorded properly, leaving the uniform hidden and unnoticed until the morning discovery. Every detail pointed to good intentions rather than negligence, a fact that Davies found reassuring. Even with this understanding, Davies knew that the discovery had wider implications. It highlighted the importance of careful record-keeping and communication within the palace. While the uniform had been safe, the incident could have caused unnecessary concern if it had gone unnoticed for longer, or if someone less experienced had handled the trunk. It was a reminder that even small actions could have unintended consequences in an environment as structured and high-profile as the royal household. The lieutenant called a meeting with the senior staff later that afternoon. Mrs. Linton, along with other housekeepers and security personnel, gathered to discuss the incident. Davies explained his findings, emphasizing the careful handling of the uniform and the likelihood that it had been moved temporarily with good intentions. He also stressed the importance of improving communication and documentation to prevent similar situations in the future. The staff listened attentively, acknowledging the lesson while expressing relief that no harm had come to the uniform or its owner. During the meeting, Davies also highlighted the dedication of the junior staff members who had acted out of concern and responsibility. "Mistakes happen," he said calmly, "but this incident shows the thoughtfulness and care that exist behind the scenes every day. We just need to make sure that such actions are properly communicated so that everyone is aware of what is happening." The room was filled with a sense of understanding and cooperation. No one was blamed, and the focus remained on learning from the experience and maintaining the high standards of the palace. After the meeting, Davies took a moment to reflect on the day's events. The discovery of the uniform had started as a routine inspection, but had evolved into a meaningful lesson about attention, care, and communication. The trunk, the hidden corridor, and the carefully preserved uniform had all come together to create a small mystery that had now been solved. Yet, even as the resolution became clear, the experience left a lasting impression. It was a reminder that life within the palace was not just about ceremonies, schedules, or appearances. It was about the people who worked quietly and diligently to ensure that everything ran smoothly, often without recognition. The guards returned to their posts, carrying with them a renewed sense of purpose. They knew that their role extended beyond physical security. It included vigilance, attention to detail, and respect for the privacy and dignity of the royal family. For Oliver, the youngest guard, the experience had been especially educational. He had witnessed firsthand how observation, patience, and careful investigation could turn a small anomaly into an understanding of the larger system. It was a lesson that he would carry with him for the rest of his career. As evening approached, the corridor returned to its usual calm. The uniform remained safely stored, documented and accounted for, and the palace continued its rhythm of quiet order. The minor mystery had been resolved, yet the story left a lasting impression on those who had been involved. It was a small episode, perhaps unnoticed by the world outside, but it reflected the dedication, care, and professionalism that defined life behind the scenes at Kensington Palace. Davies paused for a moment before leaving the corridor, looking at the uniform one last time. It was a simple piece of clothing, yet it represented so much more: the diligence of the staff, the structure of palace life, and the quiet care that allowed the young princess to go about her daily life with comfort and security. He felt a sense of satisfaction, knowing that the discovery had been handled correctly and that the lessons learned would improve procedures for the future. It was a reminder that even small details mattered in a place where precision and discretion were essential. As he walked away, the lieutenant knew that the day had been significant not for the grandeur of the discovery, but for the story it told about the unseen world of palace life. The carefully preserved uniform, once hidden in a seldom-used corridor, had become a symbol of attention, care, and the quiet diligence that ensured the smooth running of the royal household. It was a story that would remain with the guards, the staff, and the lieutenant himself, a story of responsibility, respect, and the small mysteries that make life both interesting and meaningful. By the time the evening sunlight began to fade through the tall windows of Kensington Palace, the atmosphere in the seldom-used corridor had shifted from tension and curiosity to calm and quiet reflection. Lieutenant Henry Davies stood near the trunk, now carefully secured, observing the neatly folded uniform that had captured so much attention earlier in the day. The brass corners of the trunk reflected the warm glow of the setting sun, highlighting its polished surface and the care that had clearly been taken to preserve both the trunk and its contents. It had been a long day, full of questions, investigation, and thoughtful consideration. But now, finally, a sense of closure began to settle over the guards and staff involved. The discovery of Princess Charlotte's uniform had turned an ordinary morning into an extraordinary learning experience. It had started with a routine inspection and ended with a deeper understanding of the behind-the-scenes workings of the palace. Lieutenant Davies, experienced and methodical, knew that what seemed like a small incident carried broader lessons. Life within the royal household required careful attention, patience, and respect for both the private lives of its members and the responsibilities of those who managed daily operations. Every small object had significance, and even a school uniform could reveal much about organization, diligence, and care. Once the trunk was secured, Davies gathered the guards for a brief debrief. He wanted to ensure that everyone understood both the outcome of the day's events and the lessons to be learned from them. Today was more than just a routine inspection, he began, his voice calm but authoritative. We discovered an item belonging to Princess Charlotte, carefully stored but out of its usual place. It was handled with care, preserved deliberately, and hidden in a corridor that sees little traffic. This situation teaches us the importance of observation, patience, and following protocol. The younger guards, including Oliver, listened intently. For them, it was a rare opportunity to witness how investigation, professionalism, and discretion came together in real time. Davies continued, emphasizing the importance of documentation and communication. Even when actions are taken with the best intentions, as they clearly were in this case, it is crucial that we record and communicate them properly, he said. The uniform was safe, undamaged, and well cared for, but it was hidden, and that could have caused concern. Proper documentation prevents misunderstandings and ensures everyone is aware of what has been done. The guards nodded in agreement. The lesson was clear. Careful planning, clear communication, and attention to detail were as important as vigilance and security. After speaking with the guards, Davies turned his attention back to the palace staff. Mrs. Linton, the senior housekeeper, and several other staff members were present, helping to ensure that the uniform would be returned to its proper storage and that future incidents could be avoided. "I appreciate your cooperation," Davies said warmly. "It is clear that this uniform was handled with care and that the intention behind moving it was good. Our goal is to make sure that all actions are recorded so that we maintain the smooth operation of the household." The staff members responded respectfully, recognizing the importance of the lieutenant's guidance while also feeling relief that no one had made any serious mistakes. With the trunk safely moved and the uniform properly accounted for, Davies and the staff worked together to return it to the princess's wardrobe. The process was deliberate and careful, ensuring that every fold remained neat and that nothing was disturbed. The uniform was placed in its designated area, alongside other clothing items, perfectly organized and ready for the princess's use. The act of returning the uniform was both practical and symbolic, a restoration of order and a small celebration of diligence and care. It was a quiet but satisfying conclusion to a day that had begun with curiosity and tension and ended with understanding and resolution. As the evening settled over the palace, Davies took a moment to reflect on the significance of the day. The discovery of the uniform was, on the surface, a minor event. Yet, in its simplicity, it revealed so much about life behind the scenes at Kensington Palace. The meticulous care of the staff, the observation and professionalism of the guards, and the systems in place to maintain order and privacy all came together in this single, small episode. It was a reminder that even in a world of grandeur and tradition, the smallest details mattered, and the quiet dedication of those who worked there ensured the smooth running of daily life. Oliver, the youngest guard, stayed near Davies, eager to absorb every lesson from the day. "Sir," he asked quietly, "do you think anyone would have noticed if the uniform stayed hidden for longer?" Davies shook his head gently. "Perhaps," he replied, "but that is why our work is important. We are here not just to observe, but to maintain the order and care that keep the palace functioning. Every small action, every careful decision, contributes to the well-being of everyone here, including the young princess." Oliver nodded, feeling a renewed sense of responsibility and pride in his role. He understood that even minor discoveries could have significant meaning, and that discretion and care were as important as vigilance. The guards resumed their patrols, but the memory of the morning's discovery lingered. Conversations among them included gentle reminders to observe closely, document carefully, and respect both privacy and protocol. For Davies, the lesson was clear. In a place like Kensington Palace, even ordinary objects could carry extraordinary stories, and attention to detail was essential. He felt a quiet satisfaction knowing that the uniform was safe, the mystery resolved, and the palace's routines restored without incident. It was a small victory, but an important one, reinforcing the values of care, respect, and professionalism. The palace staff, too, carried with them the lessons of the day. They understood the importance of clear communication, proper documentation, and careful handling of the belongings of the royal family. The young princess's uniform, once hidden in a quiet corridor, had become a symbol of diligence, responsibility, and the unseen work that went into maintaining the household. Staff members reflected on their own roles, appreciating how even small actions could have meaningful consequences and how their dedication ensured the smooth functioning of the palace. As night fell, the palace settled into its usual rhythm. The halls were quieter, the rooms dimly lit, and the sense of order restored. Lieutenant Davies walked through the corridors one last time before ending his shift, reflecting on the events of the day. The small uniform, the trunk, and the hidden corridor had all come together to create a story that was both ordinary and extraordinary. It was a story not of grandeur or ceremony, but of care, attention, and the quiet dedication of those who worked behind the scenes to protect and support the royal family. For Princess Charlotte, the incident would likely remain unknown, just another part of palace life that unfolded quietly and efficiently. Yet for the guards, the staff, and Lieutenant Davies, It was a reminder of the importance of their roles and the impact of careful observation and thoughtful action. The uniform, once hidden, now rested safely in its proper place, a symbol of diligence, respect, and the unseen stories that made the palace more than just a building. It was a home, a workplace, and a carefully managed environment where every detail mattered. Finally, Davies paused near the corridor where the trunk had been found, taking a last look at the spot. It seemed ordinary now, quiet and unassuming, yet earlier it had been the center of curiosity and discovery. The experience reinforced his belief that vigilance and care were essential, even for seemingly small tasks. In the palace, no detail was too minor, no observation insignificant, and every action contributed to the larger story of life within its walls. He felt a quiet sense of pride in the team, knowing that together they had handled the situation with professionalism, respect, and attention to detail. As he left the corridor and made his way toward the main hall, Davies reflected on the human side of palace life. Behind the formality, tradition, and routine, there were moments of curiosity, care, and small mysteries that made life inside Kensington Palace both fascinating and meaningful. The day's events, centered around a single uniform hidden in a quiet corridor, had illustrated this perfectly. It was a reminder that even in the most organized and carefully managed environments, surprises could occur, and how those surprises were handled defined the character and professionalism of those involved. By the end of the evening, the palace was calm and orderly. The uniform rested safely in its designated wardrobe, the trunk was secured, and the guards and staff had returned to their duties, carrying with them the lessons learned from the day's events. It was a small episode in the grand scheme of palace life, yet its impact was lasting, a reminder of the importance of observation, discretion, communication, and care. The hidden uniform had become a symbol of the quiet diligence, respect, and professionalism that ensured life within Kensington Palace continued smoothly and respectfully. As Davies finally left the area, he knew that the story of the hidden uniform would remain a subtle yet meaningful memory for everyone involved. It was a story of careful observation, thoughtful action, and the quiet efforts of those who maintained the household. Life in the palace, with all its routines, traditions, and grandeur, depended on the diligence and respect of those who worked behind the scenes. The uniform, once hidden, had now returned to its rightful place, and with it came the satisfaction of a small mystery solved, a lesson learned, and a day well managed.